Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome joining us for those joining us virtually and in person. My name is Beatriz Cantada. I'm the Director of Engagement for Diversity and Inclusion. Before we begin with our presentation, I do have some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank my programming team, Paulina Wolf, Alejandro Ramos, and Molly McInerney. Our AV team, Tom, for making this hybrid event possible. Thank you very much. Our senior leadership support, Provost Cindy Barnhart, former interim Institute Community Equity Officer and Professor Dan Hastings, Vice President for Equity Inclusion, Carl Reed. Our colleagues at Lincoln Lab. I also want to acknowledge one of our faculty advisory committee members who's joining us in person, Professor Chris Zegras, who's here. Thank you again for your support. Our faculty host for the presenter is Professor Dean Eccles. Thank you. And also members of Sloan community, who is the host department for our current presenter. There are also scholars joining us both virtually and in person. Jean-Luc Pierrit, Denise Frazier, Angelina Viceza, Christine Taylor Butler, Tawana Dillahunt, and Wasalu Jacob. Note that we will be recording this session. Friendly reminder, please stay muted during the presentation. Live captioning is available. For those joining us virtually, lunch is on us. Paulina will post an Uber Eats voucher in the chat function for you to use within the next 3 days. Please subscribe to our newsletter, ico.mit.edu, if you'd like to hear more about our events and future presentations with our MLK scholars. Of note, our next event will be on April 9th with Denise Frazier, who's joining us here in person. So more about our presenter. Kwabena Donkor is an assistant professor of marketing at Stanford Graduate School of Business, a faculty fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and was a 2022-2023 Fletcher Jones Faculty Scholar. His research areas are behavioral economics, industrial organizations, marketing, and labor economics. Donkor's work combines insights from behavioral economics with data and field experiments to study social norms, identity, and how these constructs interact with policy within the marketplace. He studied at the University of Ghana and holds a BA, MA in economics from Hunter College, as well as an MS in agricultural and resource economics and a PhD in agricultural and resource economics, both degrees from University of California, Berkeley. His honors include an IRLE dissertation fellowship and a UC Berkeley Mentor Research Award. Without further ado, I pass the mic to KD or Kwabena Donkor.
Thank you, Beatriz. I could turn this off. I don't need it. Well, thank you for offering it, though. Thank you all for coming. You didn't have to spend your afternoon with me, but you did, and so I'm really grateful for you being here. And so I just want to talk to you about my journey and some of the things that I've worked on so far. And please feel free to stop me and ask clarification questions, because whenever I think of a question and I have to wait till the very end of the talk, by the time the speaker gets there, I've already forgotten what I was thinking or really how I put it together. So don't bother. You could just stop me right in the middle if you have any questions. And I don't plan on being stuck behind this podium right here. So so I'll be moving around a bit. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about my time as a cabbie in New York City, and then I'm going to talk to you about how that impacted me working on social norms, basically talking about tipping in taxi cabs in New York City. And then I'm going to talk to you about my work on identity and how it interacts with economic incentives. And then I'm going to talk about Obamacare and how that impacted farm workers, migrant farm workers, and then tell you about some future work that I'm excited about, and then some reflections after that. Okay, well, I'm an immigrant, born in Ghana, came here for college. Didn't work out so much because I couldn't pay for Hunter. It wasn't so much, well, now I say it wasn't so much. I think it was maybe $3,000 or $4,000 for a semester at Hunter College, CUNY. And it was a lot of money at the time and I couldn't afford it. So I had to drop out for 4 years And my first job was in a place called, I worked at KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken. It was this bootleg joint in Jersey called, was called Kennedy Fried Chicken, but we called it KFC. So it's not the KFC that you're thinking about. This is a place in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And then from there, I worked in the South Bronx as a dollar store manager. So it's like 21 in the South Bronx. So this is 163rd and Prospect. I don't know if any of you know the Bronx, but that's where I worked as a dollar store manager. Okay, so I'm working there, but my goal is I want to go back to college. You know, I'm saving money, but you know, for dollar stores, you work almost 7 days a week. You know, the owner wants you there all the time. You're going in maybe like 8 in the morning, and then you're getting back like 9 p.m. So it's really intense. And you know, I had applied to Hunter for all the 4 years that I was out of school. Every year I applied to Hunter, and I got in, but couldn't go. And then the next year comes, and I applied to Hunter, and then you're like, oh yeah, you can come. But then, and so finally, I was able to gather a little bit of money, make it to the $4,000, I think at the time. But then I needed to work to, you know, pay the bills. And then the owner of the dollar store wasn't too keen with, well, you want to be in school. I need you here like 12 hours a day. And so that's, you know, that's not really going to work for us. But really what nudged me into quitting that job and then go into school was basically this Hebrew text right here. So I was born a Seventh-day Adventist. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it's just a Christian group where they keep the Sabbath, right? But when I was in New York City, I wasn't doing a lot of that, right? And so I remember one time just reading this text right here. And you know, I'm not going to read all of it. Maybe I'll just read the very first part. So it says, if thou turn away thy foot because of the Sabbath from pursuing thy business on my holy day, and then call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, and blah, blah, blah. And then you get here, and then it says that I'm going to give you all these blessings. And I'm like, okay, I need to find a job that's going to allow me to keep the Sabbath, and then I get all the blessings, right? And so, and then I decided that, okay, well, driving a cab is the way to go. And then I knew a lot of immigrants who had moved here who were driving cabs. And so I said, well, how do I get to drive a cab? And they're like, you have to take a 24-hour class in New York City, and then you get a license, and then there's a geography test, and then you take that. So I took that and then started off as a cabbie. So now I'm in Hunter College. I'm a cabbie, so I work some of the days, especially I worked on the weekends, and I worked 24-hour shifts. So you didn't want to be my cab. So I was a guy who hadn't slept for because I wanted to free up the weeks so that I could be in class, right? So I'd work 24-hour shifts from Saturday night all the way through Sunday. You didn't want to be my cab. But then it was always, well, you're so young, why are you a cabbie? That's what all the other cab drivers would ask. But then coming from Ghana, when you pay for stuff, nobody is expecting you to give them extra. But then I start driving this car, you know, people are paying me money, and then they're adding, you know, a little bit extra. Of course, now I've stayed here for some time, so I understand, well, people tip. But then what was really strange is the fact that when the interaction between me and the passenger wasn't that great, they still tipped. And the tips were not terrible, right? The tips were not terrible, still good tips, right? So that was really strange for me to sort of understand, why are people paying for the bill and also giving me this extra money, even when, you know, we're not really seeing eye to eye, and you know, they're still tipping. And I want to draw your mind to this, where I'm sure you've all like gone to these, like now you can even go to, let's say, the flea market or some place, and then you might actually serve yourself, and then you still get the screen that tells you, you know, why don't you give me 30%, right? Or you might order something online where you are going to go pick it up yourself, and it still asks you to tip. And so when I got to grad school, these were some of the things that I was thinking about. I was like, okay, there's this strange behavior that I saw as a cab driver. But before grad school, I went from Hunter College and then got an RA job at Princeton with a professor called Hank Faber. It turns out that he was working on yellow taxi cabs in New York City. I believe that's why I was hired at Princeton as an RA, because during our interview, he told me he was working on the cabs, and then I showed him my license. And then, and then he told all the other professors, did you know that this guy is a yellow cab driver? And so I knew he had the data. So he had the data of the universe of all yellow taxi cab rides in New York City, right? So every single ride that's ever been taken, and the transactions from the fare, exactly where it was picked up, where it was dropped off, the fare, the amount of tip that was paid. And so that's really how this project was born. And what I want to draw your mind to with this figure is, these guys are not crazy for showing you those options, right? Those options actually do have an effect on the way people tip. So what I'm showing you here, let me just drag this up here. What I'm showing you here is how people behave when they're shown these options, right? So in taxi cabs, initially they used to show 15, 20, and then 25%. And so you really should be focusing on these shaded bars right here. So you see 15%, a whole bunch of people are choosing that, a whole bunch of people are choosing 20 as well, and then 25%, right? And then they were like, okay, well, screw it, we're not gonna show you 15 anymore. We're gonna shift it up, we're gonna show you 20, 25, and then 30%, right? And so what you see, this mass right here just disappears, right? A whole bunch of people shift to 20 and then 25, and then people do go to 30 as well, right? But then not everybody went there, right? You see that the mass here is also increasing. So people decided we're not going to use the options, we're pissed, and we're gonna do what we want, right? But what's interesting is that it still wasn't a bad idea. You know, the average tip was about 17%. When they used to show you 15, 20, and then 25%. And then it went up to almost 19%. So give or take, it was a good deal for the drivers. No, so today I'm going to be showing you summaries. I'm not going to go so deep into that. But no, I didn't. This is not. This is just everybody and how they behave. But I want you to think about this. We all know that social norms are important. The way that economists would think about tipping is, look, I've come to the restaurant today and you're serving me, and I think that the next time that I come, I want really good service, right? And so I'm going to tip you today because we're going to have repeated interactions. But in New York City, you have 50,000 drivers. You have 14,000 cabs on the road. There are millions of people. The probability that you're going to meet the same driver twice is almost negligible, right? So this idea of, you know, I'm worried that next time you might not treat me well, really is not the motivator for why people were tipping cabs. And over 95% of people always leave a positive tip, right? So there has to be something else that is explaining this behavior, because you're never going to see this guy again, right? Now, when we think of social norms and we want to think about its economic importance, then we want to say, well, if this thing is a norm, it should be binding on behavior. People, it's binding on behavior. Well, how do we measure how binding a norm is? So this is a place where people are exchanging dollars, right? So now if the ride is, let's say, $5, and you want to pay 20%, you think 20% is the right thing to do, then it's $1, right? You pay $1 and then you're done. Now imagine that the cab ride is $100. Well, now you still want to stick with 20% is $20, right? And so how quickly people move away from what they think is best as you increase the stakes at which they have to conform to the norm is what measures how strong that norm is or how binding that norm is. So that's really the idea behind this project. Let's look at the tip rate as you increase the fare at which people have to conform. And so that's essentially in this project, that's what pins down how binding these tipping norms are. So that's like a 5-sentence summary of what this paper is going to do. And then the other question that we're going to ask is, I don't know if you've read, but in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, there are all these articles where people are really pissed about these options. And so really the question is, well, Is this bad? I mean, how many of you think this is a bad idea? People are just screwing with us. Okay, okay, I have one person. Oh, people, you all love it, even when they haven't done. Even when they, okay, I've seen people who are not. Um, okay, but let me provide another perspective of case where this might not be such a bad idea. So let's look at this figure right here. Well, this is not working anymore. So, okay, perfect. Okay, so are these defaults that they show us, are they bad or not? One of the reasons why people think we choose defaults is because there's this calculation, or you have to figure out what you want to do if you don't go with the options, right? You have to do the calculation yourself. Well, if this is indeed the case, then let's see if we can actually find within the data where whether that's true, right? Are these options actually saving us time, right? And so here, the taxi fare in New York's cabs increased by 50 cents, right? And if we think that people are converting percentages to dollars, if the fare is $17.62, what's 20% of that? Yes, it's hard, right? It's hard. But if it's really a calculation cost, then doing percentages when it's a multiple of 10, it should be much easier, right? And so what you're seeing here is what share of people actually opt out of these options, right? Which is they don't choose any of those options. Well, it should be easier to do the calculation when the fare is 10 bucks, when it's 20 bucks, when it's 30 bucks, when it's 40 bucks, when it's 50 bucks. And so this is what this is showing you, that in fact, it might be the case that these options actually make it easier for people for whom the options are serving, right? Even when it's not serving you, and you think about the time that it would take you to do that math problem versus, okay, you know what, I'm going to pay a little extra just to save myself, the embarrassment of not being able to, not being smarter than a fifth grader, right? So maybe these options are they're not always terrible. So imagine that we could, these firms know exactly what you want to do, and then they showed you an option that matches that. Then it's actually better for you. So it can be welfare improving if these options are serving us. All on the same page. So yes, there are cases where these options are not always terrible, right? Okay, so now, according to the model that I write down and the data that I see, essentially what you see in the data is that as the fare is increasing, people are moving away from these options and you're doing your own thing. And so if you think about, okay, if it was 10 bucks, you were using an option, but then when it's 15 bucks, you're not using an option. That tells me something about how costly that calculation is for you, right? Because 10 bucks is, you're like, it's okay, I'm still gonna choose it, but 15, not so much, right? So that tells us something about how costly it is, how much you're willing to pay to avoid, doing that calculation. And if we compute it, it's pretty huge. 90 cents, that's how much people are willing to pay to avoid doing the calculation. That's why we see a whole bunch of people. It's about over 60% of people are using these options. So according to the data, at least when you do the calculation, that's what it is. And then initially what I told you about how binding the norm is, right? So I told you, well, if you think the right thing to do is 20%, but then when I move the fare from $5 to 100 bucks, how quickly you how much you move away from that 20%, that tells us how binding it is. Again, you can also convert that into dollars because you have dollars exchange in hands here. And so for someone who, Scott, let me just pick on you. So if Scott thinks that the right thing to do is 20%, and he deviates from 20% and actually tips 15%, right? He feels terrible about himself. There's this like guilt involved in like being a cheapskate, right? And that guilt, we can compute it as almost 80 cents, right? So when he moves from tipping 20% and then gives 15%, that's how terrible he feels in terms of dollars, right? And so that's why we see all these people who are like, even though I had a terrible time with Kwabena in a cab, I'm still gonna pay because I feel like a cheapskate. I feel like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, right? And we can quantify that as almost 80 cents right here. Okay, so now let's come back to this idea of, are these options actually good or are they bad? And that's what this figure is telling us. So with these things in mind and having an idea through the model of what people think is right so I can essentially back out that distribution. So I have a sense of what that looks like. Now we can say, well, what options will serve people best, right? And that's this consumer welfare maximizing options. So according to the data, you should be showing people 11%, 17%, and 23%. How many people think it's not a bad menu, right? Like this, it's not so bad like 20, 25, and then 30 goes. Now it's actually, some of them are actually above 30%. And then if you want to be actually revenue maximizing, if you want to give the cab driver a lot of tips and not really consider the consumer in that process, you should show them 20, 24, and then 31%, which is what they sort of shifted it to, right? So cab drivers are making quite a bit of money, but let's see what this really means. So the blue bars here is just telling you how much goes to the drivers. This is relative to the case where you didn't show any options. So if you didn't show any options, people will still tip, but how much more would they tip if you show them the options? So that's what this is telling us. So overall welfare here. So for example, with this menu here, drivers will get an extra 10 cents for every ride. But then consumers are also benefited, right? They're almost getting about 45 cents here because they don't have to do the calculation, right? That's where that's coming from. And the same idea here, when you want to maximize consumer welfare, drivers don't get anything. Consumers for every ride get 70 cents, right? They get 70 cents. So of course, I don't think drivers will be too happy about this, but yes, you get 70 cents. And then overall welfare maximizing set of options. Basically what you're doing here is you have a social planner who wants to make both the drivers and then consumers happy. And then he says, well, you should show people 15, 20, and then 25%, right? That's sort of the midpoint in between these two. So you can see the social welfare planner says, let's do something in between. The driver gets about 5 cents, but still consumers get still almost about 70 cents, right? So that's what the model is telling us. So these options are not always bad. They can actually be good. Okay, so that's what this project is about. Now let's move on to, yes. Yep. A cheapskate. So that I've actually seen one which looks at how tipping norms vary across different countries. And one that I saw that was really interesting is for countries that have had a lot of like American tourists go in there, you start seeing these things popping up. Because I remember the first time I presented this project at Berkeley, there was a student from Germany who got upset about why do people have to do this? Yeah, but I think now it's becoming more pervasive across different cultures. But what I cannot say is, I don't know if those people, across cultures, people are necessarily feeling guilty, or I don't know what the motivation is, but it's something about this thing where people are like, okay, I guess I should do it. Now I tip. I never felt bad if I didn't tip, but now I'm like, okay, everybody does it, so I guess. So there's this conformity doesn't necessarily mean, it also like I'm signaling to people that I'm not a terrible person because everybody thinks that if we do this is the right thing, and if I don't do it, then I'm a terrible person. So it's not necessarily introspection. It can be these social influences as well. But yeah. Yep. Okay. Yep.
And here's the rationale I have in mind, that in the cab, if I understand correctly, the driver is there, you're usually tipping, for lack of a better term, in front of them.
Yep.
Versus the rideshare where you do it app-based, where there's a little bit less of an audience effect that plays a role. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, so there's actually already a paper on that where while here you have over 95% of people always leaving a tip, in Uber, I think that number is like less than 5%, because there you don't have to tip in the cab. You get out of the cab, and then later on it's like, oh, would you like to leave X amount? And no, people don't tip. People don't tip there. So there's definitely this social influence when there are other people around that really forces us to tip. That's why people tip in restaurants, because there are people there who can actually check you. Yeah. So yeah, it will differ for us. So I'll take the last one and then I'll move on to the next one.
Thank you. Oh, yes, it's on. The lack of tipping for Ubers and ride shares, doesn't that also affect your rating, which also affects how quickly you can receive transpo? You know, it doesn't.
Yeah, so there's a whole strategic game going on there. Probably, yes. I'm not sure, so I can't speak to that. Okay, so now let's move on to identity here. Okay, so this was with some grad students when I was in grad school, some friends that I had, and this is how in this project we're thinking of identity. We're thinking about how identity impacts the choices that people have, and then there's this paradigm that we have in mind. The idea is that identity impacts choices, right? But it can impact choices through preferences, or it can impact choices through beliefs, and this is what I mean by that. Imagine that I consider myself an environmentalist, right? And I have to choose between two stocks. There's a green stock, let's say Tesla. Let's assume Tesla is a green stock, and then ExxonMobil, right? So let's assume that that's a dirty stock, right? And then you see me invest in Tesla. Well, what explains my behavior? Well, it could just be one of two cases. It could just be that, well, because I'm an environmentalist, I believe that the future is going to be green. And so green companies are actually going to do well, right? So that's my beliefs, and that's why I place my money in there. Well, there's another explanation. It could just be that I'm an environmentalist, and every dollar that I make from a dirty company, I feel terrible, right? Like, you know, the utility, you know, the happiness that I get from spending an extra dollar from a dirty company is not as high as the happiness that I get if I got that extra dollar from Tesla, right? So there's this guilt associated with earning money from an identity incongruent source, right? So now when we see people's choices, well, now it's difficult. Well, is it the beliefs or is it the preferences? This is why it's important. If I assume that I'm a conservative and I vote for Trump, well, did I vote for Trump because I believe that his policies are good, or did I vote for Trump because I can never see myself voting for somebody who is liberal or, you know, the other candidate, right? Those are two very different things. If I'm an anti-vaxxer, am I an anti-vaxxer because I just don't believe the science, or am I anti-vaxxer because I'm part of this group and I'm gonna stick with them and I'm not gonna change my behavior, right? Why is this important? Well, if it's an anti-vaxxer and it's about beliefs, we can use information or education and sort of help this person update your beliefs. But if it's just, I'm never gonna change my behavior, then we can use mandates. If you don't wear a mask, you can't come in here. You know, you have to behave you have to behave in different ways. So it's really important to understand the channel through which identity is impacting choices, because the policy that you might implement might actually not work. Because if it's beliefs and you're just using mandates, it's not helpful. And if it's preferences and then you're using education, it's not helpful, right? So it's important to disentangle this. Well, how do we do this? We don't study politics or anti-vaxxers. We study soccer, folks who follow soccer, right? If you follow sports, you know, sports fans are diehard. Like, they really care about their teams, right? And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Premier League. Okay. Okay. So you have about 20 teams that play the league every year. The season is almost all over the across the year, right? So it starts somewhere in the summer and then all the way to the next summer. And so we interviewed a bunch of people in the UK and also in Kenya. A lot of Africans actually follow this league because some of the players are from there. And then we asked them a bunch of questions. And then one of the questions was, what team do you support? Do you follow the Premier League? And then took all that information. A month goes by, the league starts, and then we come to you and we say, hey, Angelino, 5 games this weekend. What are your beliefs as to what's going to happen? So you tell us what probabilities what you think is going to happen. And then after that, we give Angelino $100 and we say, these are the possible outcomes for each game. So for each game, you get $100. You decide how you're going to allocate it across the different outcomes of the game, right? And so we have Angelino do this throughout the whole season, right? And then every week we pay him if the outcome actually is realized. We pay him. So that, and what we're sort of moving around here is we decide how much you make. So sometimes we can make it really lucrative for you to bet against your team, and sometimes not so much, right? But then we also have you betting on games where you're neutral and games where you're not neutral, right? So your bets on the neutral game helps us to understand your risk preferences, right? And then, given your risk preferences, we should know how you should behave if you were neutral when your team was playing. And so we can tell what's the difference between your betting behavior when you're neutral versus when you're not neutral. But even better is, in these games, you also have bookmaker odds, right? That gives you, even Google puts out odds as to who's supposed to win. So we can actually benchmark the beliefs that you tell us against sort of this objective odds, right? And see how you behave when you're neutral versus when you're not neutral. And so what you find is that people are right on with the bookmaker when they're neutral. People are right on with the bookmaker when they support a team, and then the forecast of the future looks good for their team. They're still right on. But when the forecast is bad for their team, they're like, the bookmaker doesn't know what you're talking about, and my team is going to win, right? And then they also bet more so this is how they bet. So this is their portfolio allocation that I'm showing you right here. So the horizontal axis here tells you what team they support or whether they're neutral. So that's home team supporter, neutral, and then away team supporter. This is how they allocate their budget across the different outcomes of the game. So either the home team wins or the away team wins or there's a draw, right? So you put 50% on your team if you're a home team supporter, 20% and then 30% on the away team. When you're neutral, you put 50-50, right? So this is what the UK folks do. You put about 40 here, then you put 40 on the other game, on the other team, and then 20%, right? But then when you support the away team, you put more on the away team than you do the other team. So what are we really after here? We're really after this gap, right? This gap right here, right? When you're neutral, when you support a team, you put 50. We're looking at, well, what explains this gap between the neutral folks and then the non-neutral? What explains, when Scott is neutral, he's doing 40. When he's not neutral, he's doing 50. So what explains this gap? How much of that is coming from beliefs and how much of that is coming from preferences, right? This is the beliefs part. If you haven't done statistics, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Everything on this thing is showing you Scott's subjective beliefs as to what's going to happen. Everything to the right means that Scott really believes that his team is going to win, and everything to the left just means that Scott believes that they're going to lose, right? And so when Scott supports the team, that's the blue line. It's really to the right, which means that he believes that his team is going to win. When Scott is neutral, he doesn't believe as much, and then if Scott is an away team supporter, then he doesn't think that the team is going to win. Same pattern, whether you're in the UK or whether you're in Kenya, right? So this is the main takeaway. There's this 20% investment gap between when you're neutral versus when you're not neutral. Beliefs explain about 37% of that gap, and then the rest is explained by these preferences. But what we found that was really interesting is, how do these numbers actually change depending on the status of your team? So what you're seeing here is team rankings. This is the best team. This is a team that really sucks, right? And this tells you how much I care about. So there's this idea of a tax where it's like, if I bet against my team, it feels like that money is being taxed away. We can capture that in terms of a tax. And so if your team really sucks, that tax is really high. So people who team really suck also have like really strong identity preferences. The idea is if the team is really good and you're signaling that you support that team, people are like, of course, like, it's not, but if the team sucks and you stick with them, people are like, okay, that's the guy, right? That's the guy. And so the returns to signaling that you support that team is much higher when your team sucks than otherwise, right? So that's the stuff about identity here. Okay, so yep. Oh, yes. That's a good question.
I just asked about rivalries.
Yeah, that's a good question. We try to look at that, but we didn't have power. What I mean by we didn't have power is there's only so many times that rivals meet within the season that it wasn't enough data for us to actually pin down that's something that's statistically significant. But yeah, we did think about that. We just didn't have enough data to tell whether your identity was really, really turned on when you were playing a rival. Yeah, so we didn't have that. Basically, the idea here is that we need to take these beliefs and preferences quite seriously when we're thinking about how identity impacts, people's behavior. Yep.
Is this from a specific season? And so who are Team 6 and Team 9? Why are they similarly anomalous and have very large variance?
So I don't remember exactly what the teams were, but I think this is like Man City has been winning for quite a bit. So in this year, this was 2021, that season. So it runs from the summer of 2021 through to the summer of, well, not really the summer because that's when the other season starts, to somewhere spring of 2022. So you have Man City who's here, and of course everything is relative to them, but these rankings are from the previous season because so since you asked, let me just add this. We'll look at how portfolio performance, the asset performance, which here we're thinking of as a team ranking, but you can also think of the case, how does your identity show up if your team just won the last game or lost the last game? Your identity actually increases if they lost the last game and then decreases if they won the last game. And there's the same idea of if the team wins and you signal, it doesn't matter so much because, of course, they're all these glory hunters. So the signal is much stronger if the identity is in crisis in some sense. Yeah, so people are sort of dig in when the identity is in crisis. And if you think about the world that we're in right now, that's sort of what's happening, where people dig in if the identity is in crisis. And you've seen it here with even soccer players. Okay, so this is the last thing that I'm going to show here. This was when I was in grad school and with my advisor. So we looked at how the ACA impacted migrant farm workers. And the question here was basically, let's just look at the laundry list of the policies. It was Medicaid expansion. That didn't really happen. It was up to the states, right, who decided whether we're going to expand Medicaid to other folks. And then there were these premium subsidies. If you earned anywhere between 100% to 400% of the poverty line, then you qualify for these premium subsidies. And then there was this tax penalty if you didn't actually have insurance. And then insurance companies were not allowed to charge you based on whether you had pre-existing conditions or not. So we looked at farm workers, migrant farm workers within the US, because this was a population that really didn't have a lot of healthcare benefits or insurance. So this figure here just gives you a sense of when the policy sort of started was in 2014. So everything to the left here, the policy wasn't in place, and then everything to the right, the policy is in place. And we're looking at authorized workers. So these are documented workers. And then when you look over here, these are unauthorized workers. These are undocumented workers here. So what you see is for the uninsured, these were the folks who were uninsured. So about 60% of them didn't have any insurance. And then that drops down to almost 40% once Obamacare went into effect, right? And then what you see here, some of it is also coming from these. So this is also telling you whether they had it from the employer, whether they had government insurance, other and then private. Of course, nothing happened for the unauthorized workers. But if you were in California, these actually tipped up for unauthorized workers because California extended it to undocumented folks as well. Okay, so these are the effects. These are the findings. For healthcare coverage, so these are people who now become insured, there was a 13 percentage point increase for everybody. But then if you had pre-existing conditions for that particular group, it went up by 20 percentage points. So that was really huge for the folks with pre-existing conditions who were excluded because you were charged more if you had pre-existing conditions. Now, for healthcare use, right? So this is being covered, having insurance. Healthcare use, what we also saw was that for folks with pre-existing conditions, there was almost 23 to 33 percentage points increase. Well, sorry, for you to less likely to forego medical treatment. So they also tell us within the survey whether they're going to see the doctor, whether they're doing all these preventive healthcare measures. And then you see that there was this increase in the use of medical facilities. And then what we also saw was that one of the debates was, well, if you give people this insurance, then what's going to happen is that a lot of people are going to be showing up to emergency rooms. So there was this adverse selection moral hazard problem with this. And so the ERs are going to be overrun because now it's become cheaper, right? The ER is cheaper because I can use my insurance, right? But we didn't see that in there, but we saw more people using preventive care type options. Yep, so I don't know if we still have.
It's 12:45, so you have about 15 minutes. So if you want to continue, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Yeah, so let's see, do I want to tell you about, let me tell you about this. I presented this at HPS yesterday. It's a new project that I'm working on. And so there was this article in Bloomberg that hackers rigged the JFK Airport taxi line and scored $10 a ride. Basically, if you're a cab driver and you pick up a fare from the city to JFK, you could either stay there and then join a queue. There's a lot, and then you can pick up a fare back to the city. That fare is $70, so it's not tiny. But the line can be quite long, right? The line can be quite long. And when these three guys were like, okay, the Pentagon has even been hacked, so why not hack? In fact, because what the police did was they were actually able to go into their phones and get their text messages, and that was the exchange. They were like, the Pentagon was hacked, we might as well just hack these taxi lines. And the three of them were caught, and they're actually facing 10 years in prison. They had somebody on the inside take a USB stick and then stuck it on one of the computers there. And so basically they can print out tickets for the cab driver so they can go straight to the front of the line. But then the question is, $10 doesn't seem like a tiny amount. Why were drivers actually paying $10? Right, and I'm going to show you this figure. Do not worry, it's pretty simple to follow. Basically, the idea is that if you go to the airport, you have to decide whether you want to drive back empty to the city or whether you're going to stay in a line, right? And this is a risky choice, so you're making a decision under uncertainty, right here. And so basically, what this figure is showing you here, what you have on the horizontal axis here is basically what is the wage, what is the average wage you might earn conditional on staying, right? So if you stay, maybe you make $30, right? Well, fare is now $70. You're for sure going to make $70, but then we have to prorate it by how long you stayed to give us a sense of what the hourly wage would be. And then what are you going to make if you leave, right? So if you leave and then you go back to the city, but remember, I have the universe of all taxi rides in New York City, so I know where everybody is, how much everybody made, so I can actually compute these numbers. What you have here on the vertical axis is basically the probability of a driver staying conditional on being placed at JFK, right? Okay, so basically, if how much you would make if you leave versus how much you would make if you stay, if they cancel out, then when you get to JFK, you should just flip a coin, right? 50-50, whether you stay. So essentially, when we're at 0, your probability of staying should be 50.5, right? 0.5. And so really, this line here should be crossing at this point. This is where 0.5 is, and this is where 0 is. Now, if you're a new driver, this was the first 10 trips. This is you here, right here, the red person. Okay, you only stay. Essentially, what this is saying is you're leaving $30 on the table because you're behaving improperly. Well, what do I mean by you're behaving improperly? There's uncertainty, and then you're always leaving, right? You're leaving when there's actually about 40% right here. So you're leaving more often than you should, and you're losing $30 for every time that you do that, right? Okay, now this is the first 10 trips. 30 times 10, $300. That means that you work 2 shifts for free. So of course, $10 is a good idea. Right? Well, this, I'm not saying that people should be paying this $10, but I'm telling you why these people were in business. These people were in business because making decisions is really hard, right? Especially when there's uncertainty. And so, but what's interesting about this figure also is after the first 10 rides, when you go to the 11th through 30th, people are starting to get better, and then getting close to that point. So people are learning how to solve this problem, right? And you face real incentives here, right? $70, that's about a third of your take home as a cab driver, right? So you really want to get this right. So what this project is going to do is, how do people learn to make the right decisions, right? Because we're going to see all your histories. We're going to see how much you made when you left or how much you made when you stayed. We're going to see all that. In fact, let me end here by saying one thing that I find here is, for your first 5 trips that you stayed at the airport, if all the people around you were really good drivers, your probability of becoming a good driver is really high. And it's random who's there when you get there, because you don't know, and people arrive because passengers bring them there. So the point is, your initial conditions are really important for how successful you become, right? So in a learning environment. So I'll end there and we'll just take questions. Oh, maybe reflections, I don't know. I just wanted to share this quote because at least now I'm an academic, so we think of what we do as really important. But if I would have any policy recommendation that I think would have the most impact, it's just about people being kind and loving, right? Because you can do that. That's a policy that everyone can implement. You don't need a government to implement that type of a policy. And I believe that if people are just kind to one another, a lot of social scientists will lose your jobs. There would not be enough. There would not be enough problems for them to work on. So that would be bad news for social scientists. But I think maybe it's not so bad for the world. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Katie. So before I see hands here in person, I do want to share a question that we received virtually. Is there research on how app functionality impacts the data on tipping habits? For example, it's not easy to go back in and add a tip later if you click on the wrong button when the ride is over. So folks who want to tip not being able to tip/easily tip.
I'm not aware of anything of any work that studies that. Yeah, so I can't speak to that. Not aware.
So I see some hands in person. So Tawana, do you have the mic?
Yeah, thanks so much for this wonderful talk, and I'm grateful that you left on reflections, because that reminds me of that was somewhat of a question I had in this last your future work. I guess how well could the cabbies win if they thought of themselves as a collective, right? Like if they work together, could they make more money?
That's a great question, because when I gave this talk yesterday at Harvard Business School, the first question that came was, well, if you get to the line and a new driver comes in, you should always tell them to leave, because that's good for you. Like, you're only thinking this way because you're an economist. Like, you should give everybody bad information so you're the only one who gains. That's a good question. If everybody behaved properly, I'm sure. but I think that world is probably a little bit difficult to achieve. But if they all work together, would the pie be bigger? Probably. I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. Yeah. You need coordination, and I don't know if everybody is going to stick with the process. It's really hard.
So that relates a little bit to what I wanted to ask, but I have several things going through my mind because your presentation was so amazing and
Thank you.
very interesting. But yeah, I was thinking about this issue of surveillance and also coming together with regards to that. But just 3 quick things.
Yep.
The idea of services costing like $8 or $9, and then you end up giving a $10 bill because, the price is arranged to, automatically incentivize you to just like give away that extra dollar because there's no $8 bill or $9 bill.
Yeah.
So there's that. I was also thinking about co-checks and musicians. So there's like big tax, not tax, tipping incentives and a lot of publicity in New Orleans regarding tipping musicians. So I'm thinking also about those services where people don't necessarily choose them, because if you walk past someone busking on the street, you didn't ask them to do that.
Yes.
Versus like requesting a Cabbie or other services where I am going after you. There's other things that just enter our ears. So there's another, kind of decision making that has to happen there. So what incentivizes people to pay for something that they didn't necessarily ask for, but they're enjoying? So that's just like another thing that has been going through my mind while I'm listening to your presentation. That's a big deal down there, especially. And yeah, and then I also thought about the football example, and it made me think about something very different, but research that's happening right now about relationships and addiction. Because I'm just thinking about this whole idea of loving a team that's really bad, and you're putting a lot of energy into that, and how people, a lot of people make bad decisions in relationships, and how there's some kind of like addiction to the unrequitedness of that thing because the goal hasn't been achieved, which incentivizes that person to keep on investing in something. And so there's like so many interesting parallels regarding that example. And I thought it was brilliant that you put that up there, because it's completely unrational. And in economics, we're taught we're rational beings. But so just trying to understand why that keeps happening. Is that biological? Is it a part of our nature? Anyway, thank you so much for your presentation.
So maybe I'll start with your last question, which is like, that's way above my pay grade, whether it's biological or like, I don't know any of the physical sciences. That's why I do social science. I guess maybe I can only introspect that now economics is taking, or economists are taking social preferences very seriously, that, we don't only just care about ourselves and just building and making more for ourselves. So I think there's a growing field where now people are thinking about these other preferences that's beyond just, what I just want to make money for myself. And so there's a lot of exciting research that's coming out of that, and like sort of bringing some of these psychological models into economics. So Angelino does some behavioral econ stuff. This is where essentially hidden at the heart of econ and saying, you can't expect people to just be these robots all the time. And so there's exciting work that's growing. Of course, there's some resistance when you bring these ideas. And the econ work that I've seen that tries to include biology is genetics. That's some of the stuff that I've heard about. I don't know so much about it, so I can't speak to it. But yes, where do these things come from? It's hard. That's a difficult question. I'm not sure. Maybe. And then I just wanted to say that was really brilliant. I didn't really think about how you can think of people's relationships as this thing where they can think of in this same framework of like identify with this thing, and therefore it's hard for me to pull away, not because maybe I couldn't, but it's just because maybe I care about this person so much and that matters to me, and so therefore I stay there. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and people should tip people who bask. Social preferences, they're yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Yes.
Hi, yeah. So first of all, thank you for this amazing presentation. This was super, super interesting, and I really liked all of your research. I'm fascinated about this data set with all the cab rides in New York, and I think that combined with your personal experience is just like this really amazing combination. So I'm curious what other ideas you have for that data set.
So when I was in grad school, I asked Uber to give me the identities of their drivers, so I can see whether there are differences in tipping behavior across like women versus men, and they didn't give it to me because depending on what I found, it would be bad. It would be bad for them. So it totally made sense that they didn't give it to me. So with this data, Of course, I don't know who the drivers are. I just have an ID that tells me that this driver is the one who took all these cabs. So I think I figured out a way to pin down which drivers are Muslim. And basically, when you look in the data and you follow Angelino, you would look at the big Muslim holidays and you just see that Angelino doesn't show up on that day, and then Angelino doesn't show up on the other day, and then we infer that, oh, Angelino must be Muslim, because in the first year, and these Eid Adha and Eid Fitr happens at different times of the year because they don't follow the same calendar as the Gregorian calendar. And so you see Angelino not show up for these two holidays this year. You see him not show up the next year and then the following year. And then you can infer that Angelino is and if identity matters, now you can think of, okay, now Angelino is found to be Muslim. One thing that the passenger has is this power to decide how much I'm going to tip you. So now imagine that there's a Boston bombing. And in the cabs, you have to actually put your license behind where they can actually see your name. So you can see it's Angelino Mohammed. And does that impact the way people tip? So that's one of the ideas that I have. And I mean, maybe let me just stop there so we can get in one more. But there are the ideas as to how to use this data set. And that's one of the ways.
Thanks. Thank you so much for all the presentations and the work. I had a question about that diagram. You showed the theory under the beliefs and preferences,
Yes.
and even might apply in the football case. It seems as though over time, all of those variables are interrelated, right? Because beliefs
Absolutely.
influence preferences
Yes.
and vice versa.
Yes.
And even your choices, feedback, and in
Absolutely.
the football case, I keep betting against my team. I hate them now, right?
Yes.
And that eventually affects your identity. So
Yes. Yes.
it's not really a question, it's maybe an observation.
Yeah, no, absolutely great. This is why we didn't study politics and all these. This is why we studied this place where like these things are happening so quickly and we can get feedback so quickly that we can really think through how do these mechanisms work. Then external validity is always a problem, but at least we get a sense of how these things interact, and then we can think about the world. Suppose we didn't find that beliefs matter at all, then we probably wouldn't worry so much about beliefs in other contexts. But here we see that they both matter, and so we should take them quite seriously. So yeah, good point. These arrows don't even have to, they can go up and down too. Preferences can go into beliefs, beliefs can come into preferences, yes. But that's why we chose this context where things are really fast. Yes. But we're doing a survey for other seasons as well, so we would see whether these things are evolving over time as rankings change and all that stuff. But it's a cost of 70,000 euros to run this, so it's not cheap. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Katie or Kwabena. Thank you everyone for joining us virtually and in person. I also want to remind everyone our next presentation is on Tuesday, April 9th with Denise Frazier. So please enjoy the rest of your afternoon and we hope to see you again. Thank you.